Caterina Sforza was born on January 2nd, 1463, in Milan, Italy. The Sforza family was a noble family that acquired the Duchy of Milan in 1450 and ruled until 1499. Her father, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, became the 5th Duke of Milan in 1466. Her mother was his mistress, making Caterina one of his illegitimate children, but he didn't treat her or her other siblings as such. Her father passed away in 1476 in an assassination involving men from the Milanese court. She spent her early years living with her mother, and when her father became Duke of Milan, her and her siblings were sent to live with him and be under the care of their grandmother and eventually their father's wife, who adopted the children and cared for them as her own. Like with many noble families, Caterina received the same education as her brothers. She received a humanistic education, learned Latin, and was educated in philosophy, on writers and artists, and she was even trained in the art of combat, which would turn out to be very important and beneficial to her. At the age of 10 in 1473, her father made an arrangement for Caterina to be married. She was betrothed to 30-year-old Girolamo Riario, the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. The marriage was arranged to strengthen ties between the Sforza family and the papacy. These types of arranged marriages were common between powerful families to help strengthen alliances, and typically the marriages would not be consummated until the woman was of proper age. It was all business with different demands on either side. Riario became Lord of Imola in 1473 and would later become Count of Forli, two cities which she would eventually rule over. In 1475, when Caterina was 12 years old, they were married and went on to live in Rome under the service of the Pope. And it wasn't until 1479 that she gave birth to her first child and would later give birth to 5 more children. Her time in Rome went well and she seemed to enjoy it. She was well liked and treated with great respect all throughout the city, and she was even a bit of a fashionista and inspired many women with her style. She learned about ruling and politics as they spent more time in Imola and Forli, and the couple's power continued to increase until the Pope passed away. Riario had made quite a few enemies, and now that the Pope was not around to protect him and keep things running as they were, things pretty much went south from there. There was disorder in Rome and riots all throughout the city, as well as attacks at their residence in Forli. One night, while 7 months pregnant, Caterina assembled soldiers that had pledged allegiance to her and rode into Rome on horseback, wearing a silk dress, velvet hat, and sword at her side in order to occupy Castel San Angelo on behalf of her husband. The castle was the perfect location to keep an eye on the Vatican, where cardinals were supposed to meet and elect a new pope. There were also many cardinals that were probably plotting against her husband. From the castle, Caterina had artillery pointed at every street that led to the Vatican, and sometimes she would even fire off some warning shots, which in turn kept cardinals from meeting and electing a new pope. They were pretty much all afraid of her and worried what she might do. They tried to persuade her to leave, and at one point were even able to come to an agreement with Riario, who was waiting outside of Rome, but she refused to leave even after hearing that her husband had accepted one of their offers. For 11 days, she pretty much had control of Rome, negotiating with cardinals, and she finally agreed to leave on October 24th, 1484. She made her way back to Forli with her family, where she had a whole new set of problems thanks to Riario's terrible rule. Not to mention, the newly elected pope was an opponent of Riario and refused to continue to pay for his services as captain general and never paid him for leaving Rome, which was part of the agreement when Caterina left Castel San Angelo. So the people of Forli weren't happy with the way he was running things, and he was constantly under attack, with several attempts having been made on his life. It is said that Caterina would hang heads outside their fortress gates in order to warn others not to plan any attacks on her family. Ultimately, though, Riario was assassinated on April 14th, 1488 by the Orsis, who were another noble family from Forli. So Caterina was 25 at this time, and she was taken prisoner along with her 6 children as a mob broke into the palace before more help could arrive. Even though she was held captive, the defense fortress in Forli refused to surrender. So this is where it seems that her great negotiating skills came into play, because she convinced the Orsi's to let her out so that she could try and persuade the fortress to surrender. The Orsi's took her word for it, seeing as she would be leaving her 6 children behind as hostages, but it seemed as though she just wanted to get free and get back to the fortress to save herself. Now, this is an interesting story of what happened once she was let out. Once the Orsi's realized that Caterina was not going to have her forces surrender after she threatened them with vengeance, they threatened to kill her children in hopes that this would convince her to surrender once and for all. And as a response, it was rumored that she went up to the fortress walls, lifted her skirt, exposing herself, and yelled, "Do it if you want to. Hang them even in front of me. Here I have what's needed to make others." It's also said that she was pregnant with another of Riario's heirs at this time. So in her mind, she felt she had all she needed to continue with her power. Seeing as Caterina would not surrender and fearing that her uncle, Ludovico, the Duke of Milan's armed forces would arrive at any moment, the Orsi surrendered the children and left her to continue to rule over Imola and Forli. So about 2 weeks after Riario's death, Caterina became regent of Forli. Although one of her first acts of power and revenge was to destroy the buildings owned by the Orsi's family, distribute all their belongings, and have them hanged, she went on to rule Forli with wisdom and proved to be a capable and resilient leader, and even employed various tactics to maintain control. She would send gifts to lords in neighboring cities and would rule in a defensive position so that she wouldn't jeopardize anything that she had acquired. She strengthened the city's defenses, making it more resistant to attacks. She personally commanded troops and led successful military campaigns, earning her a reputation as a skilled strategist. She even trained and fought alongside her soldiers, which inspired loyalty and respect from them. She implemented various reforms and policies to benefit the people of Forli, who had been very unhappy under her husband's rule. And since the city had previously run out of money, she focused on economic development and encouraged trade within the city. And like any powerful woman of the Renaissance, she promoted the arts, attracting artists and intellectuals to Forli, which in turn helped the city flourish. So she really earned the trust of the people as they saw everything that she was doing for them and for the town. So although it seemed that she kept herself pretty busy with all of this and trying to defend Forli, she had time to fall in love again. She fell in love with a handsome man named Giacomo Feo. He was a stable groom and brother of the Castellan of the fortress in Forli. However, he was assassinated after people feared he would take over and rule Forli instead of Caterina's son and heir of Riario. I guess the people in the town saw how in love she was and feared that she would give over her power. So Giacomo was attacked while they were riding back home from a hunting trip. Caterina and her daughter, who were riding a bit further up, were able to escape to safety. But after everything went down and when she saw that Giacomo had been stabbed and cut up into pieces, she wanted revenge again. According to a historian in that time, she didn't just want to hurt the men who did this to him, she wanted more. She showed up at the home of the men who did this with foot soldiers and took the wives, some of who were pregnant, and cut them into pieces. They also took 3 of the children and killed them as well, and then burned their homes. And another thing, she also had them put their hands outside so that everyone in town could see. She continued her revenge on anyone who may have had anything to do with the assassination and had many people imprisoned and exiled. 38 were executed in total, and after this massacre, Caterina began to lose support of the people in Forli. After a few years had passed, in 1496, she met and fell in love with Giovanni de Medici, who was a member of the prominent Medici family from Florence. In September of 1497, they were married with the consent of her uncle, Ludovico, and her children. Caterina and Giovanni had a son together a year after they were married in April of 1498, and this would be her last child. During this time, however, the affairs between Florence and Venice were getting pretty rough, and she had to keep Forli prepared for anything. Forli was along the main route between the two cities, which is why she always had to be prepared and on high alert. While Giovanni was out in the battlefield, he became ill and had to leave to try and recover, but he ended up passing away in September of 1498, 5 months after their son was born. So once again, Caterina was left alone to defend her territories. She continued to train her military and had help from her uncle, but the Venetians did eventually attack. There was quite a bit of destruction done to Forli, but in the end, she was able to come out on top, and the Venetians had to find another way around to reach Florence. After her incredible defense against them, she was nicknamed La Tigre. The next year, in 1499, the French had claimed the Duchy of Milan and the Kingdom of Naples and gained support from the Pope. So this meant that Caterina and her army of 900 men were left to defend Forli from the French army and Cesare Borgia, the son of the Pope. After a month of fighting and destruction, Cesare's army was finally able to penetrate through the fortress, where they stormed in and took her as prisoner, but not after a bit of resistance. So knowing that the French would not take women as prisoners of war, she surrendered to the French king's representative, but she was still held prisoner by Cesare Borgia and the Pope in Rome because Cesare called her a guest in order to get around that French law against women prisoners. So unfortunately, that idea that she had just backfired on her. In June of 1501, Caterina was finally released and she left to Florence, where her children had been, and she lived in the villas that belonged to her husband Giovanni for the rest of her life. Now, during this time, she found a way to pass the time now that she no longer had any power over Imola and Forli. She experimented in alchemy and would document all her experiments and recipes, and this was something that she had been interested in throughout her whole life, but was now able to commit more time to it. While in Forli, she and her apothecary Ludovico Albertini had a garden set up with herbs and vegetables that they would use to create all kinds of recipes. And once in Florence, he would even send her special herbs and other substances so that she could continue to experiment. The recipes were put together into a manuscript, and her son Giovanni ended up saving them and taking care of them. The manuscript, titled Gli Esperimenti, contains 454 recipes, 358 medicinal, 66 cosmetic, and 38 alchemical. Some of those recipes included treatments from headaches to epilepsy to infertility, an elixir recipe to protect against illness and cure diseases, recipes for poisons, and even how to make false gold. Despite being known and even criticized at times for her masculine ways, Caterina was one that always took care of herself and made sure to maintain her feminine beauty. She was often described as beautiful with blonde, wavy hair and a nice complexion. She also loved fashion and collected jewels and clothing. So it's no surprise that her book had to include some cosmetic recipes like balms for the skin, perfumes, and how to dye your hair and lighten your skin. Her son kept the manuscript and it was continued to be passed on through the family. Her grandson, Cosimo de Medici, the Grand Duke of Florence, even built a place to conduct his own experiments and had his own botanical garden to grow plants and herbs for medicinal purposes. The manuscript is now in a personal collection, so unfortunately we can't make it out to a museum and get a good look at it for ourselves. Caterina passed away in Florence on May 28, 1509, at the age of 46. She caught a severe case of pneumonia and was never able to recover. Although it did look like at one point she would recover, she ultimately ended up passing away from that. She was buried at the Murat Monastery in Florence in front of the main altar. Years later, a plaque had been placed there by her grandson, the Duke of Florence, but today there is no trace of the tomb or any of her remains. Her legacy, however, still remains all throughout Italy and Forli. She's known as the Great Lady of Romagna and the Tiger of Forli, a woman who did what any man would have done to protect his territories or his family. She really lived her life fearlessly. She was definitely an important figure and she lived her life by her own rules. She did what the men would do in any of those situations at that time, and she always had the full support of her family. Her mother, adoptive mother, and her uncle were always supportive and encouraged her to live the way that she did. Was she a bit too harsh at times? Probably, but it was pretty much what she had to do in order to survive. It was all part of that Sforza way of life. Thanks again, and don't forget, if you want to hear more about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, follow me at History by Lynny on Instagram and TikTok. Until next time.